Niisiis, Juliet Sizmur, palun, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Am I switched on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Hello, and welcome, and thank you for inviting me to your very beautiful city. I arrived on Friday and have spent the weekend enjoying all the delights of Tallinn. And like Andrew, I'm very happy to be here. I work for the National Foundation for Educational Research in England and Wales, and we're an independent research charity. We do a lot of government research, often evaluating educational initiatives or interventions, and increasingly looking at value for money for various interventions. We also run the international studies like PISA, PEARLS and TIMS in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales for the ones that they choose to be involved in. But a large part of NFER is an assessment unit, and we develop a lot of the national assessments that Andrew was describing. Particularly, my area is primary school, but we have done them up to junior secondary as well, whereas the exams for 16 and 18-year-olds tend to be developed by other exam boards and so on. So that's just a bit of background about where I've come from. And I wanted to just start with a question to brighten up your brains after lunch. Why do we assess pupils? Why do we assess students? Just have a chat with the person beside you whilst I get organised. I'm glad to see you're all wide awake. Does anybody want... Can you hear me? Does anybody want to offer an answer to that very broad question? Anybody like to offer an answer to that? Why do we assess students? I think it's a tradition in many countries. That's right. And often, you know, we use assessment to provide information on pupil achievements, and particularly to those outside of the pupil-teacher relationship, to parents, to further and higher education establishments, institutions, to employers. Very often that's the case. Sometimes, and as Andrew was describing, often the case in England, we use assessment data to hold individuals or institutions to account, to make them accountable for what they're doing. And of course the other way is to use assessment to help build pupils' understanding within the day-to-day lessons of what they're learning. And it's in that third area that we've been researching, ways of using formative e-assessment to inform pupil learning. So I'm going to tell you the story of a test that we developed, a set of tests that we developed from conception through the realisation, and then explain how one primary school integrated it into their assessment system. The research and development took place from 2005, and we were aiming to design a low-stakes formative tool to support teachers. And during the course of the development, we learned something about the benefits and drawbacks of e-assessment. The assessments that I'm going to tell you about are located in the context of primary education. I think, are most of you secondary schools here? But I'm sure you'll be able to see parallels in relation to your own particular subject area or area of interest. The overarching principles are the same. So a little bit of history or background about assessment in England. Some of it has been covered by the previous speaker. But for 11-year-olds, for the last 20 years, we've had these statutory national tests in the areas of reading, writing, maths, science until last year, although this year, 2010, there were still science tests, but not for every child aged 11. It was a sample, national sample. The test scene really is dominated by government-mandated high-stakes national tests. We did have them for 7-year-olds, as Andrew already said, and for 14-year-olds, although they have been abandoned now. But the testing of 11-year-olds looks as if it's probably set to stay. So these tests carry high stakes for teachers and for schools, less so for the students themselves. It's an accountability regime which is supported by politicians and by the public and by parents and newspapers and so on. Less so by assessment academics and by the professionals themselves, because it's sometimes regarded as a bit of a whipping tool. But that's the situation in England for the top of primary school. And at the same time as this quite intensive testing, there's also been the formative assessment movement, which has gained ground in the UK and promoted by the Assessment Reform Group, who are very much focused on formative assessment. We call it assessment for learning. And they have been very successful in their efforts to have assessment for learning recognised, in that it's now an explicit part of policy in England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. And teachers throughout the UK are expected to understand and apply the principles of formative assessment or assessment for learning as part of their classroom repertoire. So this is the definition the Assessment Reform Group put forward. Assessment for learning is the process of seeking and interpreting evidence for use by learners and their teachers to decide where learners are in their learning, where they need to go, and how best to get there. I should say that no assessment in itself is inherently formative. What makes it formative is the use that's made of the assessment results. And it is formative when it informs the future learning of that particular student or child. As I'm sure many of you know, true formative assessment is the constant dynamic process of day-to-day teaching. It's where teachers find out about their pupils' prior knowledge and with them agree the next steps in their learning. It's a continuous process of questioning and feedback that enhances learning through collaborative inquiry and appropriate planning. Dylan William, who is the great guru of formative assessment in our country. He says, he describes an assessment as formative to the extent that it supports better decision making. And I think that's quite a useful way of looking at it. It's better decision making by pupils, learners, by teachers, by schools, whatever. So I'd like to talk a bit about the principles of assessment to support learning and how the test that we developed, what we were aiming to do in developing it. So I'm going back again to the assessment reform group and the web link on the bottom of that slide. They describe 10 principles of formative assessment for learning. Principle number 1. I'm just going to go through these quite briefly, the 10 principles. Assessment for learning should be part of effective planning and of teaching and learning. So teachers' planning should provide opportunities for both the learner and the teacher to obtain and use information about progress towards the learning goals. It also has to be flexible to respond to initial and emerging ideas and skills. It's not a case of one size fits all, this sort of delivery model. It does have to be interactive. And teachers should also be planning how learners will receive the feedback, as the Minister was mentioning this morning, how they'll take part in assessing their own learning and how they'll be helped to make further progress. So that's all part of the planning for assessment and learning integrated together. Principle 2, formative assessment should focus on how the students learn. So the process of learning has to be in the mind both of the student and the teacher when the assessment is planned and when the evidence is interpreted. And learners should be encouraged to think as much about how they are learning as what they are learning. Principle 3 says assessment for learning should be recognised as central to classroom practice. So much of what teachers and learners do in the classroom can be described as assessment. It is effectively good teaching. And tasks and questions prompt learners to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding and their skills. What the learners say and do is then interpreted, and judgments are made about how the learning can be improved. And these assessment processes are an essential part of everyday classroom practice, as I'm sure all of you know. And they involve both teachers and learners in reflection, in dialogue, and in decision making. Principle 4 of formative assessment is that AFL should be, AFL is how we often abbreviate, but can be used interchangeably, formative assessment, should be regarded as a key professional skill. Teachers require the professional knowledge and skills to plan for assessment, to observe the learning, to analyse and interpret the evidence of learning, to give feedback and to support learners in self-assessment, helping them to become autonomous learners. And it should, you know, we think that teachers should be supported in developing these skills through initial and continuing professional development. And that they are specific skills that need time to develop. Principle number 5. Formative assessment should be sensitive and constructive because any assessment has an emotional impact. And teachers should be aware of the impact that comments and marks and grades can have on learners' confidence and enthusiasm. And it's important to focus the comments on the work rather than the person because they're much more constructive for both learning and motivation. Principle 6, assessment should take account of the importance of learner motivation, and any assessment that encourages learning fosters motivation by emphasising progress and achievement rather than failure. Again, echoing what the Minister said earlier on. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, and the other aspect which I mentioned before is helping learners to become autonomous in their learning. If we can develop methods which protect the learner's autonomy and provide them with choice and some constructive feedback, then it creates the opportunity for self-direction, which is important. Principle 7. Formative assessment should promote commitment to learning goals and a shared understanding of the criteria by which they are assessed. And it is really important that the learners know what they are trying to achieve, what it is that they're trying to achieve. So communicating the assessment criteria involves discussing with the learners and using terms that they can understand, providing examples of how the criteria can be met, and engaging the learners in peer assessment and self-assessment so that they can recognise what a good piece of work will look like. Principle 8. Assessment for learning should ensure that learners receive constructive guidance about how to improve. Somebody showed me some old school reports that his mother had kept since he was a child, and every single term that he had a comment from the teacher which said, should try harder, could do better, and he said, even as a child, he said, what does that mean? I'm trying my best. I don't know what it is I'm supposed to be doing. And, you know, constructive feedback is really, constructive guidance about how to improve is really important. So we need to be clear. And constructive about weaknesses. I absolutely agree we should not be counting the number of errors that people make, but there are ways of presenting misunderstandings in a way that will help to move the learning forward in a positive way. Principle 9. AFL should develop the learner's capacity for self-assessment so that they can become reflective and self-managing. So independent learners have the ability to seek out and gain new skills, new knowledge and new understanding. And they're able to engage in self-reflection, to identify the next steps with support if necessary, and develop the skills of self-assessment. And Principle 10, AFL should recognise the full range of achievement of all learners. It should be used to enhance all learners' opportunities to learn and to enable them to achieve their best and to have their best efforts recognised. So those are all the nice idealistic principles of formative assessment. I'm going to tell you about our assessment INFER plan. What we felt was that currently most of the assessment data is used to report to external parties and that it should be used to make a difference in the classroom. So just looking at the cycle of assessment where you plan your teaching and learning, carry out an assessment, reflect on that, set targets, start again planning the next cycle. This is the thinking underlying the package that we developed. And most particularly, I want to think about effective questioning and feedback, which are two key areas of assessment for learning. So it was against this background that we began to consider how an electronic assessment could be made useful to teachers in the UK. We had extended discussions with teachers, with head teachers, with local authorities and so on. And the challenge for us was to develop an automated system which gave feedback that was accurate and fine-grained enough to actually be of practical use to teachers in planning teaching and in grouping the pupils. So we made a number of decisions at the outset about the purpose of our assessment and what we wanted it to do. We decided that it would not be a high stakes assessment, and although after the pupils had done the tests and challenges, we could provide summative reports in terms of total scores and levels and so on. That was not going to be the main purpose of the assessment. And that it was intended to support teaching and learning by providing focused feedback that teachers could use with their students, a tool that teachers could hopefully find useful in the classroom. We decided that the assessments would be curriculum-based in the 3 core subjects. This is primary level, of English, mathematics and science, for the whole of the primary school age range. And that sort of matched the national curriculum testing. And that within that, we were going to break them down into curriculum topics so that the teachers could see a clear relationship with their teaching plans. The national curriculum tests often cover a very broad range, the whole of the curriculum really, but we wanted to focus them more specifically in curriculum topics. So for a reading assessment, we might look at a particular text type, like biography or poetry or newspaper or so on. Mathematics, it might be fractions and decimals, or for science, green plants and electricity. I'll show you in a minute the areas that we decided on. But having made that decision, it meant we had to do a large number of quite short tests in order to cover most of the key areas in the curriculum. So there are a lot of small tests. And the other thing we wanted to do was to see, to make it possible to assess a topic before and after teaching it, so that if done prior to the teaching, it would give some specific guidance, and then done after the period of teaching, hopefully a measure of progress. So each unit therefore had a pair of tests to be used before and after the period of teaching. So these were the decisions we made at the conception stage. And so it was an assessment which was formal in terms of being composed of questions and answers, but mainly formative in purpose. We thought about the assessment purposes and processes, whether they, formative and summative, formal or informal. And although this is a simplification of a very complex picture, and there is overlap across all the borderlines there, we still think it's helpful in establishing a broad categorization. So, formal summative testing for the purposes of summing up a pupil's attainment at a particular time. Formative and informal, this is classroom assessment. This is proper formative assessment in its purest and most dynamic form, where the assessment is informal, ongoing, responsive, and where the teaching and learning is adjusted and finely tuned. We then also have summative and informal, where you have a collection of pupils' work that's gathered of evidence, a sort of record of achievement, for example, a portfolio of work. And then we have INFER plan. This is where we placed our product. We wanted to develop a formal assessment which had formative outcomes, or outcomes that could be used formatively. So in summary, we have a series of short regular assessments. We don't call them tests, we call them challenges. And all of the tests can be marked instantly with reports that are available online. There are opportunities for extensive summative reporting, including levels, age standardized scores, progress measures, and so on. But our main focus was to provide practical, descriptive, formative reporting, helping teachers to make a difference in the classroom, as I said before. So, that was the plan. Next was actually doing it. And so we had a development process which began with test specification, where we decided what we were going to do, generation of questions by teams of researchers, supported by teachers and focus groups, so that we got the appropriate focus and difficulty. We then had a stage of informal trialing or small-scale trialing, where we discussed each of the questions with groups of pupils, small groups of children, using a modified sort of think aloud technique. So we sat in very detailed groups discussing their interpretation of the question to make sure that they were thinking the same as us, because invariably, particularly with small children, they see things completely differently, and it was very illuminating actually to hear the pupil responses. But it helped us to refine the wording of the questions and the response options. And we wanted the questions to be thought-provoking and not restricted to just the retrieval of superficial knowledge, you know. And by going through the think aloud process with the pupils, we were able to see that some of the questions were drawing on more complex and educationally more important processes, which we were pleased about. Technology development, and I'll come back to. We then did large-scale trials with hundreds of pupils and some analysis. Going back to the test specification, I'll show you quickly. Each one of these boxes is a pair of tests for the different age levels. So for reading, we had 6 units for each age level, and we covered things for 5 to 7-year-olds, things like stories and fables and traditional tales, information, poetry, early reading, and then more with the later age groups, stories, play scripts, poetry, newspapers, letters, biography, persuasive texts, explanation. The information and explanation texts were they were closed walled garden websites, but effectively it was looking at the skills needed for reading a website, which again are quite different for pupils to be able to navigate around websites. For maths, we had a similar sort of number of topics: number calculations, money, measures, data handling, algebra, angles and rotation, position and movement, and so on. Things that would have been part of the teaching in those age ranges, and similarly for science. Animals in the environment, forces, electricity, life cycles, how plants grow, and so on. So you can see that it was quite a wide range of testlets covering the curriculum. So we generated hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions covering all of those areas, and trialled them with the pupils. When then we sort of narrowed down our selection and picked out the ones that appeared to be working best or addressing the sort of higher level thinking of the pupils. And within each subject area, we identified assessment focuses. And some of these were already defined by the national curriculum materials, not all of them, but as an example, these are the assessment focuses for a reading test. So we would aim to have a number of questions focusing directly on these particular areas of assessment. So the first one is basic decoding. sort of low-level skill, depending on how old you are, about being able to read the text. The next one is about retrieving, basic retrieval of information, being able to read a text and take information from it. AF3 is about making deductions or inferences from the text, so reading between the lines and developing more in-depth comprehension. Number 4 is questions which require the pupils to be able to comment on the structure or organization of different text types, and that included grammatical and presentational features of the text at text level. Number 5, we would have questions looking at the writer's use of language, probably a bit more so in narrative texts rather than in information texts. But, you know, even within a newspaper, we would ask them to identify perhaps a persuasive argument or something like that, looking at the techniques of the author and the writer's intentions. And how, in number 6 is the writer's intentions, how the author might manipulate the reader by using specific techniques. So they're quite sophisticated levels of understanding. And then number 7 is more of an overview relating the text. So it's quite a range. It's not just about being able to read something. It's quite sort of in-depth focuses that the questions were designed around. And similarly with maths and science, some of the focuses, I'll try and remember, I haven't got them all here, but thinking scientifically, understanding the applications and implications of science, communicating and collaborating, using investigative approaches, and working critically with the evidence. And for maths, we've got problem solving, communicating, reasoning, processing and representing data, interpreting data, and discussing results. So we carefully addressed all the different areas that we thought were really important to be able to test and to see how the pupils were doing in each of those areas, so that we could have sensible feedback at the end of it. We also looked at the progression of thinking skills, and tried to cover a range, looking closely at the complexity of the thinking processes behind each question. So at the simpler level, it was basic knowledge, the basic mechanics or the terminology or the tools. Remembering, really, is what we were asking them to do with those kind of questions. Then there were comprehension questions where they were required to demonstrate knowledge or understanding. And application where they were asked to use that knowledge and understanding. I hope that you can relate these to your own sort of teaching areas, so that the knowledge, and they have to have the tools and the knowledge and understanding before they can start using them and manipulating. For analysis, it's about making connections and comparing, classifying, categorizing, and so on. Synthesis, they're able to use a range of different sources or form an overview of their understanding of the subject area. And for evaluation then, it's critical review and reflection. By this stage, they're secure in their knowledge and understanding, and they're beginning to be able to manipulate it and be creative with what they know. And we think that this progression of thinking skills can be applied to any learning process, however basic or complex it is, whether it's learning the alphabet in order to develop reading and writing skills, or whether it's becoming a nuclear physicist. You still have to start with the basic terminology and mechanics before you can then go on to work creatively with it. So At the same time that we were writing the questions, we had a technology partner, excuse me, who was developing an authoring tool in parallel with the questions. We developed a number of different item templates, including video and animations that could be dropped into the questions. We made a decision to use voiceover so that pupils could elect to have the question read to them. So that, not for a reading test, obviously they had to be able to read it, but for the science and maths, we didn't want their reading skills to be a hurdle in order to answer the questions. And behind the item templates, we had some quite complex marking algorithms for combinations of different marking options and how the marks would be awarded. And then, you know, we constructed the tests and putting them all together. We considered the possibilities of computer adaptive testing, but for the purposes that we wanted to use it, we wanted to have the same picture for all the pupils, and we decided that a fixed test in this instance was preferable. We also decided to stick with closed response items because they were certainly easier to mark with the computer, but also because of the trialing that we had done, we felt that you could, you know, a multiple choice question doesn't have to be a really simple ABC choice. We felt that you could get to quite complex levels of thinking by a carefully constructed multiple choice question. Somebody told me that the Royal College of Surgeons in London do their final exams by multiple choice. I haven't seen the examples yet, but they must be good. So then we did large-scale trials in schools. I mean, really large-scale, of all those pairs of tests that I showed you. They were trialed with a minimum of 800 pupils per challenge at the right age range. And they were all linked by a complex sort of jackknife design so that each pupil did 4 or 6 different combinations of tests so that we could look at them all together. And in order to be effective formatively, we wanted a way of providing feedback that was descriptive rather than numerical, or I should say as well as numerical, because we had the numerical information there. So for that, we use this latent class analysis to generate information about the patterns of strengths and weaknesses for individual pupils. So you might get 2 pupils who have the same score on a test, but by looking up the patterns of response, you can see that they've got 22, a mark of 22 for completely different reasons, and there would be areas where they had strengths and weaknesses, and we wanted to find those out and to see which pupils could be grouped together according to where they were. There were also some attitudinal questions about whether they enjoyed that particular subject or not, and we also looked at the length of time that they spent doing the test and so on. And when the patterns of response came out, we interpreted them into words, which we then called profiles. And for each profile of strengths and weaknesses, we looked at how we could suggest next steps in learning for each of those pupils. So, demonstration. I'm going to show you some of our tests now. If you bear with me, I'll just see if I can find it. Hope this is it. example questions. I'm not sure how many people were here yesterday? Only a few. Well, if you don't mind, I apologise. I'd like to show the same example because it's the one that I know best, but I can show some other examples later. This is a play script, actually based on a true story, because I wrote it. What does that mean? Did I just say okay? Yeah. So the test has come up like this. This is a reading challenge for age 7 to 9. It's based on play scripts, and it will take you in. For this stage, you can have a...
This reading challenge will help your teacher to find out more about your reading. First, you will read a play called Ben's Birthday Present. After this, you will answer some questions about what you have read. While you read, you can turn the pages by clicking on the More arrow. Some of the questions will challenge you to think hard before you pick the right answer. When you are ready to start reading Ben's Birthday Present, click Next.
So that's the only bit that's read to them. For the upper age ranges, they don't have any reading at all in a reading test. For the younger ones, they can have the question read to them, but they can obviously have the text read to them. So they start with a text, and this is Ben receiving a birthday present, which is a tent, and he wants to have his friends over to stay the night. They can flick through the text, just reading through, to know what they are. They can go back if they want to check something. So when they've read the text and they're happy that they've seen all they want to say, they go on to the next phase, which this is part of the... It seemed to be taking a bit of time. Not sure why it's doing that. Perhaps I'll just go back. Don't know if that will work. I had a dilemma about whether to do it online or do it from the disk. And I tried to do it online yesterday and met some difficulties. Now I'm doing it from the disk and getting different difficulties. I'll keep going. Technology, we love it. So then they're asked how much they enjoyed it, because it is a measure of how much they will engage then with the questions, and how they feel about doing the questions. And then this is just a few of the item types to show you the kind of thing that they can do. First question, what kind of text is this? It's basically recognizing whether it's a poem, a story, play script, or an instruction. They have the opportunity to read forward and back in each one. So they always have access to the text as they're answering the questions. This is a play script. This is about recognizing the purpose of different aspects of the play script structure. So why do we have these things here? It's introducing the characters. This is setting the scene, so helps the reader to imagine the scene. This one tells the reader who's speaking, Ben or Ben's mum, and this one tells the actor what to say. So it's recognizing the structure of the text we're asking them to do there. Question here is, what was each of the children thinking as they started to build the tent? And this is never explicit in the text. It's a play script. All they have is what the children are saying to each other. So they have to make some inference and deduction about the characters to know that Ben is very sneaky. He's pretending that he knows how to do it, but he doesn't have a clue. Tessa is always willing to have a go. She hasn't done it before, but she thinks she can learn. And Joey, who's the little one who just finds the whole thing really exciting. And they have to have read between the lines in the text to know something about the characters and know what they might be thinking. This is a question about ordering a summary of this particular scene and what happens when they begin to settle in. So it's recasting, rewording what happens. I'm not sure if I can remember the answer to this. Joey begins to imagine things. And at first Ben is really cross. Joey begins to worry even more. Tessa tries to be reassuring, and then Ben gets really scared too. So there's quite a lot of deep understanding has to go into answering that question as well. Oops, I've moved Ben the wrong place. Okay, next. Different ways of answering questions. This is what they're asked to highlight the words that tell the actor what to do. So they can answer by highlighting a piece of text or change it if they think, oh no, actually I meant to say that. She runs back into the house. And this one is, who do you think would have said the following things the next day at school? So again, it's really understanding the character from what they've read, making inferences and predicting what that kind of character is likely to say. I won't read them all out, but it's quite... Now sometimes, and I can't show you on this disc copy, but if the child presses next and this question is wrong, or some of it is wrong, they might get a little bit of immediate feedback where it shows the ones that they've put in the right position, but then says have another go and you know, rethink it. Don't think it will show that on here. I'll just see. Oh yes, it does. So these two are correct. And then it says, so have another go. Think carefully about how each of the character behaved in the play, and then click on next to try again. So it gives them a second chance to rethink that. And that is accommodated for in the marking. They would get fewer marks for getting it on the second go, but you know, it's something that we didn't perhaps develop as fully as we might have, but we could in future generations a bit more about instant feedback like that within the test. And this is another question type which we think has the potential to be really useful. It's used a lot in thinking skills research. Not specifically the way that it's used in this question, but you might use a diamond 9 like that to prioritize things, or things that are most important or least important or whatever. In this one, it's again looking at text types and seeing if they know the difference between play scripts and story scripts and the way that things are written, like stage directions. In a play script, or direct speech could be in a play script or a story, whereas something like Once Upon a Time is clearly story text, and so on. So there are quite complex thinking processes going on there. Anyway, they've got, I think, the tests vary in length. These are, as I say, just some examples, but probably 20 to 25 items, maybe fewer for the sort of 5-year-olds. And then at the end, something about their confidence in how good they think, or how well the tests are done. So that's just an example of some of the questions. We've got science and maths as well, and if we have time later, I'll show you some more examples of that. And then this was my backup in case my demonstration didn't work, so I'll quickly flick through. These are just screenshots of what you might see. So yeah, as I've said, feedback is a central idea of AFL. And assessment information can be elicited in many different ways, as we've discussed, formal and informal. And the profiles give feedback about the strengths and weaknesses in words, not in numbers. We wanted to give suggested groupings for teaching, next steps, and some child speak profiles. This is an example of a child speak profile, and I'll show you some more in a minute, but it's 4 or 5 bullet points. It is essentially, this product began as something we called Formative for teachers, and somebody asked yesterday whether the child would be sort of expected to interpret this. It is only a starting point for the discussion with the teacher, but the teacher has their own profile, but this is something they can discuss with the pupils in a language that we hope they will understand. It's quite possible at secondary level you wouldn't need to translate it into simple language like this. So when they've done their test, they can immediately run the sorry, I may just have to. I thought that was. That's why. Bear with me. They can immediately run the. Perhaps I'll just show you the screenshots. The reporting files. So, depending on what the teacher wants to do, we always ask the teacher to have the assessment purpose in their mind, because the purpose is integrated into the reports, and the teacher should select the purpose before selecting the pupils and what they look. So if they look to view performance on a single test, then they would go to, can I do this? You can probably see it. Then they choose the subject area, they choose the class that they want to look at, and which test that they want to look at. If the teacher then runs the report, they can get something that looks like this. Can you see that okay? And so that will give you the raw score. I didn't explain what the scale score means, but basically it's like a standardized score out of 50, and that helps because some tests are more difficult than others. It helps the teacher to compare the pupil performance on a scale score out of 50, where the mean score is 25 and the standard deviation is 7. So all of the tests have their raw score translated into a scale score. The AF columns are the different assessment focuses we talked about, so you can see whether a particular pupil is performing better in a certain area. Tells you the length of time that they've taken. If you hover over the name, where it's underlined the pupil name, it will take you into a special report just for that particular pupil. I think I've got a copy of that. The teacher can also look at a slightly distorted picture there for planning teaching. So if the teacher goes through to another report to plan teaching, they can get a profile, a pie chart, and it shows you where the students are grouped according to the particular profiles that they've been assigned by the latent class analysis. It tells you the groups of pupils in the different areas, and then it can see what each profile consists of. So here we have a profile of a reasoning reader, where they have relatively high attainment. They show clear understanding of the ideas in the text and is able to use inference and deduction to make connections and sometimes to make predictions. The reasoning reader is interested in play scripts and recognizes the presentational features of a play script, and is able to use empathy to develop understanding of character, and sometimes can grasp implied meaning. This reasoning reader still needs to consider characterization and motivation beyond the literal, and how the author conveys this. And then there's some suggestions for next steps. Discuss how a character's motivation is often reflected in what they say, and consider other occasions when it may not be reflected in what they say and why. So it's asking the pupils to really think how character is conveyed within a text. We then have some suggestions for developing skills and enjoyment. And these, the teacher can, use these if they wish, or they may have their own ideas, on how best to develop it. But the information's there, should they wish to use it in teaching. And I think I showed you the child script version. You can also click on a particular pupil, and you get the latest profile, a summary of the profile. We have in England national curriculum levels from 1 to 10. At age 11, we expect pupils to be around level 4, and it takes approximately 2 years to move up a level. So this 2A and 3B levels are calculated as part of the reporting system. You also get an age standardized score and confidence intervals. And the more tests that the pupil does, the more reliable their level will be. And you can see on the other side the level probability. In this case, given the 6 tests that this pupil has done, the probability of being level 2 is 68%, but there's a 32% chance that they might be level 3. And it tells you the details, the whole record of the tests that that particular pupil has done. You can also review group performance. You can look at boys against girls, pupils with English as a foreign language, all the kind of monitoring systems that they would normally have in school. So anyway, then we had the product, but we wondered what schools or teachers would make of it. So that was the next phase of our research. And the product was launched in January 2008. And currently, quite a long time later, we've still only got about 100 user schools. But we followed up a number of the first users from spring 2008 until summer 2009. We had 6 schools who were initially involved, and 4 of them were tracked through that whole period. And that's allowed us some examination of the way in which an electronic assessment designed to be low stakes and a formative tool for teachers, how it could be integrated into a school's assessment practice. So in each school, we found that every school had a champion, a senior member of staff who took the decision to introduce it, and that is vital. There really needs to be somebody who wants to do this and is prepared to sort of drive it forward. And although the e-assessments were installed and began to be used quite quickly within each school, we discovered that there was a wide gulf to be crossed between that one single enthusiastic user and full implementation across the school. You know, it wasn't as straightforward as we expected it to be. Here I go with my technology again. Bear with me. One school. Talked like this. Is it going to work? Yes. No. I've got no volume. Is it this? Sorry.
It is easy to use. The children enjoy doing it, and it practically runs itself once the children know they're logged in.
Yeah, we needed accurate information that everybody has confidence in, that goes beyond teacher assessment, but fundamentally what we're talking about is enabling children to learn, and to learn more, and to learn more productively.
Some things can be dangerous to eat and should be kept out of reach. Click on to dangerous things.
These are all the assessments that my class have done, so I can see how well they've done on each assessment focused. And it gives me the time, which is very useful to me, because I can, if necessary, show children that they spent longer on the assessment than they did. And a profile. This is where I find it very useful to give me an overall picture of how the children are doing.
This is Molly. Drag the words to label each part of Molly's body.
We found very young children were able to work with it.
One question was about what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat.
Because it's so finely tuned, I think INFER have worked very hard to get the levels as accurate as they can.
Tom is blindfolded. Ali directs Tom to pick up a ball using the words left, right, and straight on.
It's very, very supportive to teachers.
Which is what we like to hear. That particular teacher, I remember, she also said she found the profiles really useful for reporting to parents, that it was meaningful to parents in a way that, you know, sometimes numbers and levels weren't always. But, you know, what we did find was that the implementation of this new approach took much longer than we expected. We thought it would all be operational after 3 months, and in fact we found that when we went back to see how schools were getting on with it, they were really still experimenting to see what it could do and what they could get from it. And sometimes it was 1.5 years later before it was fully embedded in schools. And it's possible that this, you know, is the timescale it takes to introduce any kind of curricular change or pedagogical innovation. But I'm just going to tell you now about one school who did embed the use of it. Primary school, which moved a bit more quickly than the others. It was a school of 250 children, aged 5 to 11. In the South Midlands, it was a relatively new school in a newly built housing estate. The intake was neither particularly privileged nor was it particularly deprived. It had below average numbers of students who were eligible for free school meals, so it wasn't a deprived area. Did have an above average proportion of students learning English as an additional language. But it was a well-equipped school with a computer suite, but also had a trolley of laptops that it could take into classrooms and be used flexibly. And most important of all, they had a skilled full-time ICT technician, which we discovered was a very important contribution to the successful introduction of an e-assessment, and something that was not available in all the schools in our sample. So if you dropped into this school, you would expect to see teachers explaining the learning intentions, identifying the gaps in the children's learning, planning teaching to build on the strengths and fill these gaps, and giving feedback. And we hoped that they would be using our product in order to do all these things. This school does have a well-developed assessment policy, and the e-assessment takes its place alongside other approaches that they were using within the school, including the development of assessment for learning. This is a learning wall which they have in all the classrooms, designed specifically to explain the learning intentions of what they're doing. In this one it says we are learning to solve one-step and two-step problems relating to measurement and the perimeter. One of the things that schools developing formative assessment have found trickier than you would imagine, actually, was describing the learning intentions and to explaining to pupils, this is what we're learning, this is what we're trying to do. Teachers were often in the habit of saying, this is what we're going to do today, and telling the pupils what they're going to work through, with it actually focusing on the learning. And it's this very subtle difference, but it's a very important one. And on the learning walls, they also have work which is sort of gathered around the learning intentions to exemplify achievements, because another important aspect of AFL is modelling, and to share with the pupils what a good piece of work looks like, and perhaps show them something and discuss it with them, identify the success criteria, what makes this a good piece of work and what are those features. And by having that discussion with the pupils, then they're more able to apply those principles to their own work, but very much focused on what I am learning and not what I'm doing. So within this context, we think that e-assessment can make several specific contributions. The first one is this very quick overview of the children's attainment. So if you can do a quick e-assessment, they do engage with it very quickly. It's very natural to them, and the teacher can very quickly have a picture, an objective, a snapshot of objective information, and it's immediately available. But it's not an end in itself. It is just a starting point on which the teachers can build. All the teachers interviewed said that they talked about the importance of identifying and closing the gaps in a children's understanding. So for having a baseline assessment, this is what one teacher said, for a baseline assessment in September, when you want to get the assessment done as soon as possible so that you know your next steps, just the quickness of it has been really helpful. And leading on from this, the provision of the strengths and weaknesses in the profile reports and the suggestions for next steps, the teachers had found that helpful as well. It says these three all came out with the same profile. So you can look at that group, put them together and say, right, as a group, these children need to be working on this area. Can we do that through guided reading? Yes, we can. So that's an example of focused feedback used formatively, and the potential for this figured largely in this particular school's decision to introduce INFER plan. We also had evidence of children learning to work with the formative profiles, and this girl recognising herself. This was, I think she had been doing explanation texts, and she said, you need to think carefully about how writers choose certain types of words to make their explanations as clear as possible. I think that's myself, because I have a bunch of words. I can't sort out what they mean, whether they're explaining words or command words. And so the girl's comments show that her profile has helped her to highlight the confusion that she's still experiencing in identifying specific vocabulary that structures an explanatory text. So by reading and reflecting on her reading, it also then will impact on her writing when she's constructing her own things. So can a formal e-assessment support formative assessment? As I said before, you know, this is not pure formative assessment by any means, and the evangelists would say, you know, tests have no place in formative assessment. However, although we totally acknowledge that tests don't have the immediacy or of spontaneous classroom interaction, we do think that the used in this way, they can give a range of information which is the same for each child and perhaps broader and more balanced than a teacher might get from classroom interaction. And I suspect that's even more so in secondary schools, where you're only seeing pupils for short bursts of time. And you can very quickly get, you know, a broad range of information. We think they give a well-informed starting point for observations and discussions, and it is, again, to support your teaching. It's not a solution, it's just something, a tool that we hope would help teachers. It gives teachers a shared language. The children most definitely engage with it. They say it aids their concentration. And as I said, we have had very young children, aged 4 and 5. Somebody's actually done some with 3-year-olds. And because it's part of their life and what they've grown up with, it doesn't seem alien at all to young children. And sometimes teachers have been surprised by the results. One that I mentioned yesterday was a 7-year-old boy, and the teacher had assumed he was well, she knew he was a poor reader, and thought that he was also poor at maths and science, but because he was able to use the voiceover on the questions and have the questions read to him, he performed surprisingly well because the need for him to read the questions was removed. And when the teacher recognised that he had a sort of much deeper understanding of maths and science, he made exceptional progress. Yeah. So, as I say, there are some people who think that formal tests don't have a place, a part to play in formative assessment, but we think that they can make a contribution that complements other approaches. That's our view. Another criticism sometimes is that it's sort of, is it going to de-skill teachers and prevent teachers from engaging with the learning? Is it a quick fix that prevents teachers from developing skills? And we don't think it is, and certainly not in the schools that we've visited. Partly because to adopt this kind of scheme actually needs to be part of a thorough review of assessment policy. And it's actually quite complex. It's not particularly quick. If somebody wanted a quick fix, there are much simpler products that will just give you, you know, a score. In our, oh, here it is, we've got 110 separate tests, 25 different reports screens, and then that imposes a high threshold for understanding of the potential of the product. It is quite hard for teachers and schools actually to get their head around the potential of how a product like this can be used. However, having said that, when they've done that, they really then begin to be able to reap the benefits as we had intended. It did take the fastest moving school 6 months to approach full integration, and the others it took much longer. And these are schools who wanted to do it. You know, they were already enthusiastic about the technology. And I think we found the biggest single barrier to the uptake seems to be the understanding of what the assessment actually can offer them. Teachers need time to play around and experiment, but we think that it can help teachers to integrate formative assessment, help them to personalise learning for individual students, and support their own teacher assessment by knowing where the pupils are, knowing what to do about it, and knowing whether it's worked. And the other thing that we found in the schools that we visited was they all did say how having to focus on those descriptive profiles really made them engage in professional dialogue, teacher to teacher, discussing the difference in performance and what it really meant and how they could teach it. And it did seem to aid professional development. So our conclusions are that formative assessment can be used successfully to support learning in the classroom. And that's the formative aspect as we see it. It's how the assessment can be used to support learning. The crucial factor is how the results are used, and that is very much up to the teachers using them in the way intended. And that this continuous dialogue and reflection between teachers and learners, between teachers and teachers, but particularly with the pupils, it does seem to improve motivation, and as a result, it improves results. Professor Mary James says that quality and formative assessment has to be part of the pedagogy. It responds to what pupils reveal of their misunderstandings and helps them to move forward in their learning. It does require teacher expertise and peer support, and in the really strong teacher learning communities that are developing in the UK, it's very much a lot of discussion between teacher and teacher, and peer support, peer observations and discussions, but it's all aimed at promoting learner autonomy. The research focus in the UK has shifted from over the last 10 to 20 years actually, from demonstrating that formative assessment is a good thing. It's accepted as a good thing now. As I say, it's adopted into the policy of all the UK countries. But the problem now is looking in detail about how to bring about that shift in practice. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to change practice, and it's becoming increasingly recognised that it takes time. It's very slow, and formative assessment can. Some schools think they've done it or they're doing it by using this mechanistic application of techniques rather than real understanding. Gordon Stobart, who's a member of the assessment reform group, who really worked hard to promote formative assessment, he says the most important thing is to act within the spirit of formative assessment rather than the letter, because you can learn a lot of techniques, but unless you have that deeper understanding and apply it, it doesn't work. And it can fail to penetrate to all teachers. But basically, that's my example of how I think an electronic assessment can be used to support teaching. So thank you for that. There's a couple of useful websites on there which you may be interested in, and that's pretty much what I have to say. Thank you for that. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Kas aplaus tähendas seda, et küsimusi ei ole või? Järsku on küsimusi. Ja palun. Mikrofon teile ka tuleb kohe.
Oh, wait.
Tere. Ma töötan algkoolis ja tahan küsida, kui kaua läheb iga seanss, kui laps töötab koos kompuutriga? 15 minutit või 30 minutit või terve tund? See on väikesed lapsed.
Okay. On average, it's 20 to 30 minutes per test. Slightly less for the very young children, perhaps slightly more for the older children, but and they work through at different paces. In one of the reports that I had there, you probably saw some children go through in 10 minutes, but they don't always get the better scores because, you know, they're just keen to see what the next pictures are, but that in itself is a learning experience. They're designed to be 20 to 30 minutes each.
Kas on veel küsimusi? Ei paista. Jah.
Te ütlesite, et see programm, kui ma nüüd õigesti aru sain, läbi 100 kooli umbes. Et millest see sõltub, kas koolis võetakse kasutusele see elektrooniline süsteem toetamaks kujundavat hindamist? Kas see on kohustuslik, on see vabatahtlik, on see koolijuhi tahe? Esimene pool küsimusest. Ja teine, kas see on populaarne, kas seda kasutatakse heal meelel?
Yes, they are adopting it voluntarily. This is not a national test, although at NFER we do develop the national curriculum test. This is a commercial product developed by a subsidiary of NFER. So it's marketed as an e-assessment product, and the schools decide at the education fair or whatever if they want to buy it. So at the moment we have sold it to 100. It is being used in 100 schools. There are some local educational authorities who buy it wholesale in order to give to all of their primary schools, and they use it, the local education authority level, to monitor the progress across the different schools in their authority. So they purchase it and give it to schools. In other cases, it's just an individual school, somebody who's come to the BET show is a big electronic IT educational exhibition that happens, and sometimes it's just a teacher who comes there, sees the demonstrations and thinks, oh, I can use that in my class. Normally we would have the champion that I described, somebody who's really enthusiastic. So it's a range of customers, really. Sometimes it's the head. Sometimes it's just a cluster of schools who work together, because if they're small primary schools and they don't have a lot of money, they can agree to put, you know, money together and share the products. And they have the option of buying small units or buying the whole package. So they might just want to focus on 9 to 10-year-olds or something like that, or they might want to focus on science and not worry about English and maths. So it's flexible in that way, and schools can choose to do what they want. But I don't think there are any cases where it's been imposed upon a school. I think normally they do it voluntarily, and the feedback is very positive. I'll just read you a couple of other quotes. You said, do they like it? One teacher said, the questions were appropriately phrased with excellent graphics, so much so that the children enjoyed doing the tests and didn't realise it was work. Somebody said it saves teachers time and allows them to focus on compiling a balanced assessment of each child's progress against their targets for the year. So rather than the teacher spending time either marking tests or just, you know, discussing in detail with pupils, they felt that they could use their time more on the teaching rather than testing. And then the third quote that I have here is, the combination of summative and formative assessment information is exactly what's needed. 100% thumbs up from teachers and pupils alike. Obviously, we chose the best quotes to put on here, but generally it's been very positive. The difficulty is, as I said, first of all, getting it installed and learning how to work with it. And once the technical difficulties are surmounted, then the response is very positive.
Kas on veel küsimusi? Siis teeme ühe aplausi Julietile pika ja sisuka ettekande eest. Aitäh!